Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's solo flight special is being captained by Randy Wright. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, and we will be taking off shortly. Please return all seat backs to their original position and ensure that all tray tables are stowed in the locked and upright position. Now fasten your seat belts. Kick back, relax, and enjoy the show as we soar above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style. Once again, we thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this solo flight and Thanksgiving special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we are confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight and Thanksgiving entertainment. Well, folks, we here at the Wright Flyer have always said that the most important service that we can render to you, our cherished passengers and listening audience, is to provide you with the tools necessary to gain a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. And one of your fundamental and unalienable rights is really under threat right now, your right to life. And of course, the topic of which I'm speaking is the push by the Obama regime to flood the United States with ever-growing numbers of Syrian refugees. And of course, the governors of several states have already come forth and said that no, they would not be accepting Syrian refugees within their jurisdictions because of alarming concerns they have with respect to the safety of their constituents. That is a truly logical concern to have because we know at least one of the terrorists that orchestrated the November Paris massacre had claimed to be a Syrian refugee. Not to mention, we have an established track record of so-called Islamic refugees turning to terrorism once they have entered the United States. I draw your attention back to the Chechnyan Mario brothers, the Tsarnaevs, who orchestrated and carried out that dastardly attack at the Boston Marathon back in 2013. These are all legitimate factors that should be taken into consideration with respect to flooding our country with these so-called refugees. Now, I know that I have done previous episodes of the Wright Flyer which have focused on this issue, but because it's Thanksgiving and because of something that the president said in one of his weekly addresses that just brought this to my attention and made me think that it's very important to actually do a special show focusing on this. And that is that President Obama came out in his weekly radio address and attempted to compare these so-called Syrian refugees with the plight of the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Rock back in the 1600s. Of course, this is a false comparison, and it is intellectually disingenuous at best and outright absurd at worst. But it goes to the point of the way that this current regime actually is diametrically opposed to the will of the people. The vast majority of the American citizens do not want to open the floodgates to these so-called refugees hailing from Syria. There are not enough security checks for this. There are not enough vetting measures in place to ensure that they won't orchestrate some horrific attack like those that occurred in Paris or a repeat of the September 11th attacks. What Obama truly misses, though, is the story of survival that is quintessentially a part of the original Thanksgiving story. These people were actually experiencing a true religious persecution. That is not what you would see from the Islamic State with respect to those who adhere to Islam, other than those who might try and stand up against them. But again, that would only be if they spoke out against them. If they didn't, they would be fine. Maybe the Syrian Christians, if there are any left, or their Jewish population, once again, if there are any left, would be able to go through this vetting process. But the problem is that the regime wants to open the floodgates without allowing a strenuous background check and protection for the citizens to be put in place. And the reason they're doing that is they say that there are extenuating circumstances on the ground. But they have also come out and said that there really is a thorough vetting process that would protect the citizens of the various states from being adversely affected by this flood of new supposed Syrian refugees. But if you look at what's been happening throughout Europe, there really isn't a decent vetting process, and there can be no guarantee that those so-called refugees that wind up in the United States of America would not turn to violence. Again, I point back to the Tsarnaev brothers who orchestrated that horrific Boston Marathon bombing back in 2013. You know, that's the problem with the Obama administration. They do not ever take into consideration the wills and desires of the American people. Well, that is tantamount to being completely contrary to the natural law edicts and principles that we find within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. And the reason that I can say that is because if you remember looking at the way that our country is formed and the tenets of federalism, which are defined by the United States Constitution, it states that we, the people, are the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in this representative republic. That is an undeniable truth, yet it is being ignored by the political powers that be when President Obama goes out and makes such intellectually disingenuous comparisons on his weekly radio show or radio statement. Now, he has also had his underlings and henchmen send out a letter to these various GOP governors who have stated in solidarity and unity that they would not be allowing these Syrian refugees anywhere within their jurisdiction, to state that they do not have the authority to make any decisions with respect to whether they accept refugees or not. Now, this is interesting because really, if you look at the way that the United States Constitution is established, it says that Congress can only be the one who makes determinations for allowing immigrants or naturalization of immigrants into this country. It is all within the power of the legislature, as per Article 1, Section 8. That is one of the enumerated powers of Congress. But what President Obama is doing is trying to point to the Immigration and Naturalization Act and a particular section thereof to make this argument that the states lack the authority to bring or prevent the bringing of refugees within their territorial jurisdiction. Now, the specific section in question is Section 412 of 8 U.S.C. 1522. And what this is the authorization for programs for domestic resettlement of and assistance to refugees. And basically, what they're trying to do is say that the director of the program, to the extent available, shall make appropriations with sufficient resources for employment training and placement in order to achieve economic self-sufficiency among refugees as quickly as possible. It's also supposed to provide refugees with the opportunity to acquire sufficient English language training, thereby allowing them to become effectively resettled as quickly as possible, also to ensure that cash assistance is made available to refugees in a manner that does not discourage their economic self-sufficiency. And it was also, and here's the important part, to ensure that women have the same opportunities as men to participate in training and instruction. Well, we've already heard the Obama administration come out and say that no religious-based restrictions can be made on the resettlement of these so-called refugees. However, if they are adherents to the Islamic faith, you're going to have a problem with this idea of men and women being able to get equal participation to these so-called programs that are designed to help them. And the reason that I say this is, if you recall as to what I said in the episode covering Sharia law, the religious edicts, the codified law of the faith of Islam, expressly states that men and women are not considered equal, and therefore, by their own deeds, words, and actions, they would not allow the law to be followed. And so already, for Obama to say that there cannot be any religious restrictions doesn't make any sense, because the very refugees themselves would be making these religious limitations. And that also goes into this idea of, if they're not going to allow the women or the children or the families to be a part of this so-called education and employment training, then it defeats the intent of Congress in Section 412, subsection B1. Subsection B says that the intent of Congress is providing assistance per the section is that employable refugees should be placed on jobs as soon as possible after their arrival in the United States. Well, once again, these refugees are not of the type that have skills that would be applicable to our current situation here in the United States. They wouldn't have the ability to speak our language, and it would take a long time to train them to be proficient enough with English to actually be employed. That's assuming they even want to be employed at all. The other part that it speaks of is social funds should be focused on employment-related services, English as a second language training in non-work hours where possible, and case management services. Well, how are you going to have case management services when these people want to adhere to Islamic Sharia law and not apply to or avail themselves to the supreme law of the land, which, as per Article 6, Clause 2, is the United States Constitution? Here is the dichotomy that is faced by those of us who do not want to have these so-called refugees just dropped in the borders of our states. The fact of the matter is that already the intent has been subverted of this law that he's claiming to, and whenever the intent of a law is subverted and is being implemented in a way that it is actually contrary to the concise and express language of our shared United States Constitution, that law no longer becomes valid. Now, with subsection 2, it states that the director and federal agency administering all of this stuff is supposed to consult regularly, which is not less often than quarterly, with state and local governments while also providing nonprofit voluntary agencies concerning the sponsorship process and the intended distribution of refugees among the states and localities before their placement in those states and localities. In other words, they're supposed to talk to them, meaning the various leaders or governors of the several states and the various state entities and organizations that are supposed to be in charge of this entire process, and provide them with the information as to how best to resettle them, whether these people pose a threat or not, and provide them with backgrounds for each and every one of these so-called refugees. However, that is certainly not the case that we are experiencing with respect to this current wave and influx of supposed Syrian refugees. We simply do not have any of that information, so once again, the intent of this law has been ignored, and therefore it is also rendering that law unenforceable with respect to the several jurisdictions. Yet there are many of these so-called legal experts and scholars who have gone into, or rather onto, the salivating mainstream media to explain why governors like Greg Abbott are reading and interpreting this law incorrectly. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the language contained within the four corners of the Immigration and Naturalization law or act, are quite clear. You just cannot get around it. And see, here's another part. In subsection C, it says such policies and strategies, to the extent practicable and except under such unusual circumstances as the director may recognize, shall first ensure that a refugee is not initially placed or resettled in an area highly impacted as determined under regulations prescribed by the director after consultation with such agencies and governments by the presence of refugees or comparable populations, unless the refugee has a spouse, parent, sibling, son, or daughter residing in that area. Well, we already know that in the case of most of these so-called Syrian refugees, they do not already have relatives living in the area. And there has been no consultation from the Department of Human and Health Services that with these various state leaders to actually discuss the resettlement and the significant threats posed by these so-called refugees. It would be a direct impact on the American citizens and the actual populations of those states, the actual citizens of those states, as can be seen from the Boston Marathon bombing back in 2013. These are not facts that can be taken lightly or swept under the rug, yet that's exactly what the president is trying to do, and yet he also comes out and makes this false equivalency of comparing these so-called Syrian refugees to the religious plight of the Puritans and Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock back in the 1600s. There really is no comparison, as I had mentioned at the outset of the program, yet he wants to create this false image in the hopes of lulling the American people into a false sense of security and trying to guilt trip us into accepting those so-called refugees who actually have no interest in assimilating into or adopting and adapting to our culture, customs, heritage, and history. And it it goes to show that everything about how this has been handled has been done in an intellectually disingenuous manner. It is not taking into consideration the wants, needs, hopes, and aspirations of the American citizens. And then legal experts are ignoring how this is actually going against the intent of the law in which President Obama is attempting to cite as giving him the authority to pepper these so-called Syrian refugees throughout all 50 states here in the United States. When looking at subsection C subparagraph 2, it says also that it should provide for a mechanism whereby representatives of local affiliates of voluntary agencies regularly, not less often than quarterly, meet with representatives of state and local governments to plan and coordinate in advance of their arrival the appropriate placement of refugees among the various states and localities, and subparagraph 3 take into account first, the proportion of refugees and comparable entrants in the population in the area. Two, the availability of employment opportunities, affordable housing, and public and private resources, including educational, health care, and mental health services for refugees in the area. Three, the likelihood that refugees placed in the area becoming self-sufficient and free from long-term dependence on public assistance. And four, the secondary migration of refugees to and from that area that is likely to occur. Again, none of this has happened, and that is what these governors of these several states can place their dispute with. Because when you look at what it is saying that the government is supposed to provide, they are not honoring their end of the deal. And they are trying to browbeat the states in violation of the clear tenets of federalism as outlined and defined in our shared United States Constitution by just forcing them to accept this. Now, while the courts may interpret this to just mean that the states must bow and acquiesce, that is actually violative of the 10th Amendment. It's a violative of the preamble to the Bill of Rights. It's violative of the preamble to the Constitution. It's violative of the express enumerated powers of Congress, because here we already have Congress having passed a piece of legislation that is supposedly going to make it more difficult to bring Syrian refugees and refugees from the country of Iraq into the United States. However, I don't think that it goes far enough, because it just requires that the directors of both the FBI and the Homeland or Department of Homeland Security sign off in stating that each of these refugees does not pose a significant threat of harm to the United States. If they wanted to take that a step further and actually provide real protection and real incentive for the American people who will be detrimentally impacted by this wave of so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees, then they would take away the sovereign immunity of these directors so that the various peoples could sue them as well as their departments for failing to live up to their duties and responsibilities. Of course, the government won't do that because they hold a disparate bargaining position with we the people, and therefore they will continue to act in a rogue fashion, which clearly demonstrates that their interests are diametrically opposed to the benefit and best interests of we the people, who are the true ultimate sovereigns, as I've mentioned both earlier on this show and in other episodes of the Wright Flyer. Irrespective of this fact, the president is determined to go full steam ahead with his ludicrous comparisons of these so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees to the Puritans, and is going to try and basically crush the states in court to bring about his plan, his radical plan, which is just awful. Now, I move to the next part of that law, which is subsection D. So we're talking section 412 of the Immigration and Naturalization Law, and subsection D, which states, with respect to the location of placement of refugees within a state, the federal agency administering this shall, with consistent with any policies and strategies, and to the maximum extent possible, take into account recommendations of the state. Well, already we know that they are not taking into account recommendations of the states, and the states populations have vociferously spoken out against the resettlement of any so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees within their communities. So again, we see that the intent of the regime is to not only violate the sacred principles contained within the United States Constitution, but also the very language contained within the four corners of the very law that they are supposedly tracing their authority to act from. And we have to take this seriously because when a nation of laws no longer has laws that apply or no longer has a government that follows the scopes, limitations, and applications of the applicable law, which includes the United States Constitution, again, as per Article 6, Clause 2, then you've got chaos. Because when a nation becomes lawless, it is no longer a nation. It has become a rogue state. It has become a dictatorship, a truly oppressive government, and you have potentates running around attempting to force their will upon the true wielders of sovereignty, we the people. Yet Obama looks at the American people with contempt. He just holds us in utter contempt. And we have known this since he first assumed the reins of power back in January of 2009. And he is now trying to go full steam ahead with his plans to fundamentally transform the United States. Now, I know, again, that I have mentioned this statement of his from the 2008 campaign with regularity on past episodes and editions of the Wright Flyer, but this is a true example of what he is trying to do. And it says here in subsection 3, it says, in the provision of domestic assistance under this section, the director shall make a periodic assessment based on refugee population and other relevant factors of the relative needs of refugees for assistance and services under this chapter and the resources available to meet such need. The director shall compile and maintain data on secondary migration of refugees within the United States and by state of residence and nationality on the proportion of refugees receiving cash or medical assistance described in subsection E, which was earlier. In allocating resources, the director shall avoid duplication of services and provide for maximum coordination between agencies providing related services. Again, none of this has happened. And while the Obama administration may claim that this is due to the extenuating circumstances of just the long drawn out conflict in Syria, you have to remember that these people, for the most part, had supported one faction or another, and these factions were hell-bent on the complete annihilation of the opposing faction. They are hardliners, and I don't see how we can expect them to be employable, expect them to assimilate within our country and become law-abiding citizens, because that certainly is not what history shows. And in the wake of those horrific terrorist attacks in the city of Paris, France, not too long ago, we can see that there really isn't enough here to protect us. And of course, there has been no coordination with the governments of the several states. And another part that plays into this is the federal government has again breached its duty in providing us with the information in a timely manner with respect to so-called refugees that have been flooding into the United States from across the southern borders. I'm sure you all recall those massive waves of illegal aliens who then tried to claim asylum here in the United States. And just last year, and how our courts have been strained. So again, they say the resources must be available, but we've already proven that the resources are not available. This disastrous program known as the so-called Affordable Care Act has made it impossible to cover all of this. The fact that our court systems are strained with this wave of illegal aliens from across our southern border has also made this impossible because of the federal government's complete and total unwillingness to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And now we have this completely intellectually disingenuous attempt to say that the state governments cannot deny this. Now, there is one thing that the federal agencies have said with respect to the governors of these several states refusing these refugees. It says that while it would be a violation of the law, then it would also subject those states to the removal of federal funding for these programs. Fine, fine, remove the federal funding. Why do we even have federal funding for so-called refugees? Shouldn't this be up to we the people? Shouldn't this be something that is done within the actual political process as outlined in the United States Constitution? But that's the thing. We haven't really had any of that. We haven't had any input, and this law was first passed in 1981, and therefore it has not been updated to reflect the actual conditions on the ground that exist here in the United States in a post 9/11 world. And we really do have to take that into consideration, because should we fail to do so, then we are just opening ourselves up for the sorts of attacks that would be horrific and detrimental to America as a whole. But once again, this regime does not care about that. They are so committed to their radical extremist left-wing agenda that they are either incapable of divorcing themselves from their agenda, or, which I suspect is more likely, they don't care. That's what it comes down to. They they have shown time and again that they believe that America is a disingenuous place that has reached the lofty heights that it has because its people and its government has supposedly stolen from others. Yet they seem to have no trouble trying to steal from American citizens, trying to make American citizens be less safe, trying to work in every episode against the express wills and desire and the best interests of the American people. It is quite clear then that this government is not acting for us and is not representing us. But again, the gutless opposition party is offering very little in way of actual, meaningful, real-world resistance to this, and the governors are taking a valiant stance against these attempts to browbeat them into accepting these so-called refugees, which have a proven track record of engaging in wanton acts of Islamo-fascist terrorism. And the fact that Obama went out and said that you cannot make a religious part to this. Again, you have to remember that the natural law tenets of our shared United States Constitution are completely incompatible with Islamic law, which these so-called refugees would most certainly be following. And therefore, when you stop and think about it, it would not be unwise to make a religious restraint until these people can be vetted. And again, they won't be vetted. That's not within the agenda of these extremist left-wing fanatics. It is all to fundamentally transform the United States, thereby making it easier to strip us of our fundamental and unalienable rights by redefining what it is to be an American citizen, what it is to have American values. And you can see that by Obama's just blatant attempt to rewrite history and compare the Puritans and Pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock to these so-called Syrian refugees. It is just absolute madness to try and make such a comparison when it's a totally different scenario. These people were actually sent to colonize, meaning the Puritans and Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. They had made agreements with the government to allow them to go there and were still citizens of their government, but did not have to adhere to the state religion, that being the Church of England. Well, if Obama wants to make the comparison to the Pilgrims, then that means that these so-called Syrian refugees are going to come to the United States, still show allegiance to Syria, and therefore wouldn't abide by the laws of the United States. But that's exactly what Obama wants. So in his mind, it is a legitimate comparison. But it is not a legitimate comparison because, first of all, England was not at war at the time that the Puritans and Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. The New World did not have an established government. Now, sure, there were the various Indian tribes, but again, Plymouth Rock was not the first attempt at a colony in the New World by the Empire of Great Britain. The first was Roanoke, and that was a failed colony in Virginia, and then it was followed by Jamestown. Plymouth was the third, and it was designed to be a colonization of the New World. Well, there certainly would not be colonization with these Syrians, although they might try and carve out their own Sharia law niche and then orchestrate acts of terrorism against the American citizens. But again, we don't know much because we have not actually gone through a proper vetting process of these so-called refugees. And again, the Obama administration is falling back on this Immigration and Naturalization Act from 1981, which has not been updated to keep up with the security concerns that are affecting each and every one of us. And it just doesn't seem to fit with the prerogatives of what would be important, especially in the immediate aftermath of an attack like that occurred in Paris, after we have been attacked by others who have claimed refugee status here in America with the Chechnyan Mario brothers, the Tamer and Zhokhar Tsarnaev. And then you also have to take into account that there have been ISIS members who have been detained, like at the airport in Turkey. I think this was a week or two back, where they were posing as so-called Syrian refugees. And again, it shows that the enemies of humanity will assume whatever form they want to best assist them in getting in to tear down the natural law tenets of liberty-loving places like the United States. And it shows that the law is being enforced in such a way as to be against the will of the American citizens. The interest of the American citizen should absolutely come first. But when you look at the way that this government is engaging in supposedly enforcing and enacting these things, it is diametrically opposed to our fundamental and unalienable rights of the right to life, to the right to pursuit of happiness, and a right to liberty. Because they are telling the state governments, which are representative bodies of we the people, that they don't have the right to reject these populations which might be detrimental to us, which most assuredly from the historical record would not be in our best interest to bring them over here, especially when there is an enemy that does not stand as a traditional army and would use and utilize these populations to attack American interests both at home and abroad. See, these are the types of considerations that the Obama administration has not taken into mind because they don't care. They just don't care. If it is something that they can use to fundamentally transform the United States, then they are going to adhere to it, instead of adhering to the principles contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. That is dangerous. It shows that tyranny is reigning here in the United States. And I must applaud these governors of the several states for taking their valiant stand against the oppressive hand of this federal government in forcing them to try to comply with this misinterpretation of federal law. To all of those so-called legal experts, again, I think they should be reading this law again, because it is showing that the assistance being thrown out must still comply with and display a reporting of what exactly the impact of bringing these people here would be. I have heard of no such study being brought forth. I've heard that, yes, there's a vetting process that can take up to 2 years, but that doesn't matter because it's still, as per the law itself, says that these need to be done in coordination with the governments of the several states. No attempt has been made to do so. This has all been done at the federal level through the executive branch in particular. But that is an absolute violation of the 10th Amendment, because when you look at this law, it was meant to be very rarely utilized. It was meant to be used in a specific set of circumstances which are not met here. And that is what Governor Abbott said. And that is also what the other governors who have come out against this resettlement program have said. And their arguments are valid, because when you stop and consider the great danger that these people pose, that would be the impact, the direct impact that it would have on the citizens of the several states. And as it is right now, any of these government actors and agents could not be held accountable for engaging in this deleterious type of behavior that is directly harmful to the interests of the citizens of the areas where these refugees, and I say that with air quotes, would be resettled. Why, oh, why has no one in Congress actually stepped up to completely amend this law to say that the states have the option? Because if you stop and think about it, the states have something that is known as a general police power, meaning that they have the absolute, or near absolute actually, authority to legislate on behalf of their citizens for their health, safety, and moral well-being. Now, as you can see, that is being completely violated here. Now, yes, it is true that Congress is enumerated the power to legislate with respect to immigration and naturalization. And yes, there is a statute here, but when the conditions of those statutes are not met, which they have not been, then it does fall upon the governors to act in the best interests of their people as per that general police power. And that's exactly what I think that Governor Abbott, along with those other valiant governors standing in stark opposition to this supposed resettlement program, are doing. And the American people are, of course, absolutely against this so-called resettlement program, because, once again, their interests have not been taken into consideration. Again, it seems that every level of the federal government is more interested in serving the needs of non-citizens than those of the American citizens, the ones that they are supposedly there to represent. That is the problem. We have a government that is so divorced from reality that it no longer cares about the American citizens, because it's intoxicated on its own power, which it has illicitly grabbed for itself in the or rather to the detriment of the real absolute sovereigns here in the United States, being we the people. And when you have that, you have an illegitimate government. There is no way around that. There is no way of softly putting this or sugarcoating this, because the fact of the matter is, when these governmental agencies act in such a way as to put the interests of their people in direct jeopardy, that is no longer a legitimate government. And that's keeping in with the actual spirit of our founding fathers well over 2 centuries ago. Folks, when the government does not serve you, it falls upon you to turn to your fundamental and unalienable rights, because you have the duty and obligation that is couched with each of those fundamental and unalienable rights to proactively maintain and safeguard those fundamental and unalienable rights. And clearly here, they are not respecting your property rights. They are not respecting your right to life. They are not respecting your ability to to keep working for the best of you or your community. And clearly, they are working on putting these people, which pose a significant danger and threat, within our communities. And here's the thing: where would we put these people? Why have we not seen an open record of the supposed resettlement plan? Because this seems like a logistics nightmare when you stop and think about it, especially when you take into account that we are already resettling the supposed refugees from South America that came across our border last year. This is a complete overwhelming of our system. But of course, that's in line with that Clowen principle that Obama follows strictly. And it also goes in line with Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. They will do anything to overpower the current system, to overload it, to destroy it from within, so that then they can make the people grovel at the feet of the government, seeking a solution to the problem that government itself created. That is intolerable and should not be allowed to occur, because that is completely violative of the letter and spirit of the supreme law of the land, the United States Constitution. Again, though, we have seen repeatedly, with respect to this regime, this desire to completely ignore the United States Constitution. And it's not just limited to the regime itself. The gutless opposition party, or GOP, has been feckless and spineless in any and all attempts to respond to this. And like I said, their response to supposedly tightening up the restrictions and constraints on Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees just isn't enough. It really is not enough. And they expect the American people to sit down and take this and just say, boy, you know, my representatives are ignoring my will, but that's because they know what's best for me? That's absolutely nuts. That is tyranny. That is the quintessential personification of tyranny, and we are seeing it unfold right now here in the United States of America. We cannot be complacent when it comes to the sovereignty of our nation and the safety of our citizens. And we cannot do any type of measure that would infringe upon the fundamental and unalienable rights of the citizens, because as Jeremy and I have reiterated numerous times on past episodes of the Wright Flyer, those fundamental and unalienable rights are endowed to us by our Creator, meaning that no earthly authority has the right to take them away unless we act in a way that places our, or rather their, rights in jeopardy. Now, here we have a government clearly acting in a way that puts the fundamental and unalienable rights of the absolute sovereigns, the citizens, in direct jeopardy. They are threatening our rights. And any time that a so-called refugee that has been allowed into this country via the Immigration and Naturalization Act kills an American citizen, that is a complete deprivation of the greatest fundamental and unalienable right, the right to life. And we can see that certainly with the Chechnyan Mario brothers, the Tsarnaevs, when they were brought to this country as refugees because they were supposedly being persecuted by the Russian government. And yet the government here, our government, knew that they had traveled back to Chechnya, knew that they had been back to that area. If they were fleeing persecution, why would they travel back to it? Again, this is a clear sign that the government is not handling these issues in any direct form or fashion, and it is just exposing we, the people of the United States, to ever increasing and alarming danger and threat. We should not be embracing those who have a track record of engaging in terrorism. And I'm sorry, folks, but the worst terrorist attack ever orchestrated on the soil of the United States was carried out by Islamists. There is no way around that. Over 3,000 people were killed in 9/11. Then it was with the Boston Marathon bombing, Islamists who were claiming to be refugees who decided to go out and kill innocent men, women, and children simply for the fact that they were Americans. And yet these people had been basically raised here, but it was quite clear that they were not raised within the confines of our natural law tenets, that they were not taught our culture and customs, and that they had refused to assimilate into American society. That is the danger that we are facing with these so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees, and it is something that Obama is turning a willful blind eye to. But the truth is out there, folks. All you have to do is look at the circumstances on the ground. Look at how the American people are responding, and you will know that they do not want to bring these dangerous vipers into their communities. When you are faced with a danger, does it make sense to flood your communities with the source of that danger, or does it make better sense to close off the source of danger, to isolate it? If it's a cancer, to remove it, to ensure that it does not kill the body politic of your nation. That would be the logical course to take. Yet nothing by these radical extremist left-wingers is ever based on logic or rationalism or even reality. It is all based on fear-mongering, emotionalism to its worst degree, and faulty comparisons, like the president coming out and attempting to compare these so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees to the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock. Now, why would he make such a false dichotomy? Because he wants to guilt trip us into thinking that we have been bad in the past, that we have an oppressive history. After all, you have to recall that the president has said that racism is within the DNA of the United States, and therefore we will never be able to wash it from our shores, as if any of the civil rights stuff had not happened, as if we hadn't made any progress in the 150 years since the end of the War of the States or the American Civil War, and that's just historical revisionism all over again. It's ignoring the actual truth. But they don't like the truth because the truth would deny them the absolute control that they crave. You know that Obama would love to be an absolutist dictator here in the United States. And with the way that the gutless opposition party has lined up to bow at his feet to capitulate and collaborate with him, he may get his wish and desire. But we, the people, are the true wielders of sovereignty in the United States. We delegated this governing authority to the government. And whenever power is delegated, it can be taken away. And that's why within the Immigration and Naturalization Act, it says in Section 412, subsection C, that the director may not delegate to a state or political body or subdivision the authority to review or approve grants or contracts under the chapter of the terms under which such grants are made. Why? Because when you delegate it, others may act upon it with your authority, but it can be taken away. And therefore, they don't want the states to ever have the power or authority in the first place, because they don't want to create the conflict that would result from them taking away such delegated power. But what we are facing in this country right now is nothing short of a constitutional crisis. And it has seemed to be that way with this president ever since he first assumed the reins of power back in 2009. He has pitted us up against constitutional crisis after constitutional crisis as he has attempted to ram his radical extremist left-wing agenda down the throats of the people. And he has done this to our detriment at each and every turn, without a care for the detrimental impact that it has had on the American people. This is the this is the sort of rogue and tyrannical, despotic tyranny that our founding fathers were attempting to fight off with the ratification of our shared United States Constitution. And it's important to remember that these laws, even the ones like the Immigration and Naturalization Act that have been written out, they belong to us. They do not belong to the government. And when these laws are diametrically opposed to our wants, hopes, desires, and needs, and our best interests, then we need to step up and say, no, enough is enough. It is such a powerful yet underutilized word of the English language, especially with respect to these rogue tyrannical governments that attempt to cram this nonsense down our throats, and that is the word no. You have to be willing and able to stand up and say no to these rogue and despotic federal agencies, because what they are doing is putting the lives of your loved ones, your own lives, the lives of all American citizens in grave jeopardy. And this is not fear-mongering on my part, because I'm actually pointing to the facts. We don't know who these Syrian refugees are. We don't know what their background is. We don't know whether they will adhere to the natural law tenets contained within the four corners of our shared Constitution. We do know that other Islamic refugees have carried out attacks here in the United States. We have seen Islamic refugees that then join the army and attack our people, kill innocent citizens, such as Major Nadal Hassan. We have seen it time and again that there is a clear and undeniable pattern with respect to these so-called refugees that just cannot be ignored. Yet that's exactly what the United States government, and particularly the Obama regime, is attempting to do with respect to these so-called Syrian and Iraqi refugees. It is time that we, the American people, take our own best interests into our hands, to stand up to the government and say, no, you will not flood our communities with these unvetted, unproven, unknown refugees, after there have been attacks like that which have occurred in Paris. And, even after that attack, President Francois Hollande has proven himself to be true to his radical left-wing extremism by saying that he would welcome an additional 30,000 refugees into his country, after it was proven that there were those in the attack who actually were claiming to be refugees. We cannot tolerate or accept that, not when it is the best interests of our people put in threat. And that's something that should not be up to question. It should not be up to debate. It should not be up to consideration. Yet Obama does not care. Whenever the law stands in his way, he ignores it, or he attempts to construe it in an erroneous fashion to push forward his radical agenda, irrespective of the harm that it might cause the American people. This is why, once again, folks, that it is so important that you gain a fluent working knowledge and understanding of our shared Constitution and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights, because then you have the ability to stand up for yourself, to protect yourself from these nefarious elements of government which are acting in a way that is diametrically opposed to your fundamental and unalienable rights, which is stepping up to encroach upon your rights. It is so important that you be proactive in the maintenance and safeguarding of your rights, because it is squarely upon your shoulders that the United States Constitution places that obligation. That is part of the social compact or contract that we have with the federal government. And when the federal government is acting outside the scopes and limitations of that social contract, then the government is actually in breach of contract. And we can force them to a redress of grievances. That is exactly what the Constitution is designed to guarantee, that we remain a sovereign people. But as we see right now, that is not what the current government is doing, because the current government is clearly wanting to move full steam ahead with this disastrous and supposed resettlement program, which I think is designed to strip us of our fundamental and unalienable rights and to fundamentally transform this country. But seeing as this is Thanksgiving, and I said that Thanksgiving is a story of survival, like the Pilgrims that faced great adversity when they landed on Plymouth Rock all those years ago, we too shall overcome these threats and adversity that is placed in our path by these dubious actors in government who don't care about our fundamental and unalienable rights. We always overcome every obstacle that is put in our place. That is because of the unconquerable, unstoppable, indomitable spirit of the American people. We are the beneficiaries of the greatest birthright of any people on the face of the earth, that being the United States Constitution. And so long as that remains true, we will overcome. That is the message that I send to you, ladies and gentlemen. And with that said, it is now time to begin our descent so that I may return you to your families. I hope that you all have a very happy Thanksgiving, and I invite you to leave comments and concerns either on our YouTube page, our Facebook page, or our Google Plus page. And I also invite you to join Jeremy and I the next time we take up to the skies, and look forward to seeing you then. See you next time, folks. Happy Thanksgiving.